Welcome everyone to the Magna Quake Anniversary Town Hall. My name is Wade Mathews. I'm the Public Information Officer and Be Ready Utah Manager for the Utah Division of Emergency Management. It's my pleasure to facilitate and moderate our Town Hall discussion this evening. I'm very excited about this joint partnership with several state agencies and local agencies talking about our experiences and things that we have learned about earthquakes from the Magna quake, as well as talking about ways to be prepared for future quakes. And we'll begin by encouraging you to, throughout the evening, throughout the hour, I should say, please enter your comments and questions in the chat screen on the YouTube channel where you're viewing this, and we'll be monitoring that for questions for our panelists. We'll try to direct those questions throughout the evening, and as well as answer those on the chat window itself. We'll begin by introducing our panelists this evening. We will first be hearing from Keith Koper, the Director of Seismograph Stations at the University of Utah. He will be followed by Clint Meekum, the Division Chief and Salt Lake County Emergency Manager at Unified Fire Authority. He will be followed by Emily Kleber, Project Geologist at Utah Geological Survey, Department of Natural Resources. After Emily, we will hear from John Crofts, Earthquake Program Manager from the Division of Emergency Management. And then we'll hear from Kevin Broderick, a Crisis Counselor at Utah Strong Recovery Project, Department of Human Services. So thank you again for joining us. Thank you, each of our panelists, for being here this evening. We're very excited about this discussion. And let's go ahead and start, Keith, with you.
All right, thanks, Wade. Can you confirm that you can see my slides? Did it make it through?
I cannot see your slides at this point.
Okay. Let me try to do this swap display. What about now?
Not yet.
All right, should I do share screen?
Yes, yeah, do
Okay.
Share screen. Okay, there we go.
Okay, how about now?
Yes, yep, we can see
Okay.
the slides.
All right, thanks, Wade. And thanks everybody for tuning in tonight. And, my name's Keith Koper. I'm a professor at the University of Utah in Geophysics, and I'm the director of the University of Utah Seismograph Stations. And I'm also the chair of the State Seismic Safety Commission. And I thought I'd start off with just a little description of the state earthquake program. And there's sort of three agencies that are involved in earthquake monitoring in Utah. And I represent here the University of Utah Seismograph Stations. And then later in the program, you're going to hear from other representatives. And so Emily Kleber will be representing the DNR and the UGS, and John Crofts will be representing the Division of Emergency Management. And then you can see there's also these other agencies that are part of the Seismic Safety Commission. And so there's really a diverse group of engineers, scientists, insurance experts, policymakers, and so forth that all work together to do monitoring, seismic monitoring in Utah, and work together to reduce the earthquake risk to residents of Utah. And my team at the university is just listed here on the right. All these folks work in my group. And what I'm going to do for my bit tonight is just do a little bit of a review of the Magna earthquake. And then I'll also sort of give some of the science results. So, it's been a year and we've had a lot of monitoring and a lot of new data. And so I'll go over just a couple of the things that we've learned so far.
Keith, before you do that, why don't you try switching back to your other screen. We're seeing your presentation view. So we're seeing all, yeah, let's just try that. There we go. Perfect. Thank you.
How's that? Is that better?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Yeah, thanks, Wade. Okay. So, the first point I want to make is that, the Magna earthquake was not a surprise. And this figure just shows some of the historic earthquakes that we've had in Utah, really going back over 100 years. And so what you can see is that a magnitude, 5 or larger earthquake, generally happens about once every 10 years. And so, the Magna earthquake was a magnitude 5.7. So it was the largest earthquake in Utah since 1992. And so, if anything, it was potentially a little bit overdue to have an earthquake of this size. And you can see there's many smaller earthquakes too distributed, throughout the state. And Utah is, many people don't think about it, but it really is earthquake country. And, we have to live with earthquakes here in Utah. And this is just to sort of help people appreciate that earthquakes happen essentially every day in Utah. And here's a slide that shows the initial sort of felt reports for the Magna earthquake. And you can see that each little cell on that figure on the left is somebody that reported in the shaking they felt a year ago. And then we sort of collated all the information and put it together. And, the point of this is that the earthquake was the most widely felt earthquake in Utah, sort of in history. And it was felt throughout northern Utah, southern Idaho, Wyoming, and so forth. And there's really tens, if not hundreds of thousands of people that felt the shaking, from this earthquake. The good news, of course, is that we didn't have any serious injuries or fatalities, but the damages, I've seen different estimates anywhere from 50 million to 150 million. And so it was definitely a significant event. And, it could have been much worse. And I'll come back to that point later at the end of my presentation. So one of the things we do in my group, which is the University of Utah Seismograph Stations, is we run the seismic network in Utah. And immediately after the Magna earthquake happened, even though we already have a lot of seismometers deployed throughout the state, we felt like we needed more. And so this just shows an example for those of you that are curious what it looks like. The seismometer, if you can see my mouse, is actually this cylinder right here that's sitting on a concrete pier. And there's a GPS clock in here, and there's power supply that comes in. And we usually bury the seismometers because then they couple to the ground and they give a little bit, better data, more sensitive data. And we use solar panels to recharge batteries, these deep cycle marine batteries. And the data are then telemetered in near real time. And so there's only a latency of a few seconds, and the ground motion that's recorded, by one of these seismometers out in the field is sent back to our data center in the University of Utah, within seconds, actually. And so these are 7 of these sort of higher quality seismometers that we put out. And but that wasn't enough, for us. So we also put out over 150 of these smaller, easier, more compact seismometers. And this is just one of our research scientists, Amir Alam, who was out, the day after, putting out even more of these seismometers. And this is how we gather data. And this is how we're able to study all the aftershocks that have been occurring. And so here's an update for everybody. And this is through the end of February. So this is maybe as of 2 weeks ago. there's a total of about 2,600 aftershocks that have happened since the main shock last March. And most of these earthquakes are quite small. They're magnitude 1. Every once in a while we get a magnitude 2. So they're too small for people to feel the shaking, but they're big enough that our instruments can record them, and then we're able to locate what we call the hypocenter of the earthquake. And believe it or not, this sequence is still going on. And the way we sort of define the end of the sequence is when the seismic rate gets back to what it was before the main shock. And so our current estimate for how long the sequence will continue is it could be anywhere between 5 and 10 years into the future. And so it'll take us that long until we get back to sort of the background rate. But again, most of these events are likely to be very, very small, magnitude 0, magnitude 1, and we do not expect or forecast any other large event, as part of this sequence. This shows all the earthquakes in map view, and you can see there's, this is the large cluster here. The main shock is indicated with this yellow circle, and you can see that the aftershocks filled in kind of a U shape around the epicenter, and there was actually a second plane, a second part of the fault system that was activated, and that's shown here by this cluster of events. So all the events to the west, they're about maybe 6 miles underground, okay? But the events here that are underneath the airport, they're maybe more like 3 miles underground. And so the fault itself, when we look at it at the surface, actually runs up against, the benches and the mountains. And so as you go from east to west, the earthquakes actually get a little bit deeper. And that's one of where we spent a lot of time, is trying to map out what we think the geometry of the Salt Lake City segment of the Wasatch Fault, what it looks like underground. And this is our primary, I would say, scientific result from our studies. And that is that if you imagine looking in what we call cross-section, that we think the Wasatch Fault actually curves as it goes deeper underneath the surface. And so one way to think about it's like a snow shovel. And so, the snow shovels that are curved kind of dig in a little bit more. And that's the shape that we've imaged so far for the Wasatch Fault. And the reason why that's important is that if you take this angle at the surface, and the geologists, they tell us that it's, maybe 70 degrees. And if you were to extrapolate that all the way down, then you might think the deeper part of the fault is maybe 10 miles, below the surface. And so the fact that what the Magna aftershock sequence has kind of told us is that it's actually shallower where the fault is. And that means if we do, or when we do, have a bigger earthquake, maybe a magnitude 7, that it will likely be a little bit closer to the surface than what we previously thought. And so what we're doing is we're taking this information that we learned and we're updating our models and our forecasts. So just like there's a weather forecast, there might be rain, this percentage of rain next week, we make these earthquake forecasts. And based on this new information, we're updating what we forecast for the likelihood or the probability of earthquakes in the future. And so that was really an important result that we learned by studying this, the aftershock sequence. And just a couple of take-home points that I would like people to remember. And one is that the earthquake that happened in Magna was actually a moderate sized earthquake. So it's not actually a big earthquake. And I felt the shaking, just like all of you did. And it was spooky and scary and so forth. And believe it or not, a magnitude 7 would be more than 30 times more energy than a magnitude 5.7. Okay, so the Magna earthquake, although it caused damage, it was much smaller than this larger size earthquake that we know has happened in the past. So based on sort of geologic evidence, we know that there's been something like 20 earthquakes in the last 10,000 years that have been magnitude 7 or bigger, sort of along the Wasatch. So we know that it's going to happen again in the future. The forces, the tectonic forces that control earthquakes are not going to simply turn off. And so the way I like to think about the Magna earthquake is it a wake-up call? Okay, this just gives us a taste of what, a small taste of what a major earthquake would be. And so our main message is to be prepared. We don't know precisely when one of these big earthquakes is going to occur. We do know eventually it'll happen, but there are things you can do now to help prepare and be ready. And some of my colleagues who are speaking next will go into some of the measures that you can take to be more prepared. But I think the main message, or one of the main messages, is that not everything you need to do to be prepared is expensive. So if you need to retrofit, unreinforced masonry building, that might be expensive, but there's smaller steps you can take that will still pay dividends in the case that we do have one of these larger damaging earthquakes. And I think I'll stop there and maybe see if there's any questions or comments.
Yes, thank you, Keith. That's great. Very interesting information. I love the science. It's so fascinating. So there are a couple of questions. One from George asks, does this reformatting and remodeling apply to other fault lines such as the hurricane fault?
Yeah, that's a great question. And the short answer is no. The hurricane fault, which is in southwestern Utah, is essentially decoupled. It's a separate fault system. So when we do forecasts for the hurricane fault system, we actually use a separate database, and the forecast is a little bit different.
Okay, great. Thank you. And Elizabeth asks, are curved faults able to hold as much stress as straight faults?
Yeah, we don't know for sure. It's thought that if it becomes too curved and too flat, then it cannot have a big earthquake. But we don't know the precise angle. So the answer is, at this point, we still feel like the Wasatch Fault is absolutely loaded, and the fact that we discovered this curvature does not mean that the risk has been reduced.
Okay, thank you. And thank you for those questions. As we have Clint Meekum, our next panelist, come up on his camera, we'll just remind everyone, continue to put your questions and comments in the chat window. And if we have more questions for Keith or any of the other panelists and we have time at the end, we'll try to bring those back up as well. So thank you, Keith and Clint. Let's go ahead and have Clint join us on his camera. He's going to talk about a little bit about the local perspective of that day 1 year ago when the Magna quake hit his county.
So good evening, everyone. And again, thank you for taking the time to join us. I apologize. I don't have a lot of slides or pictures to share with everybody, just because that day went from 60 to 100 miles an hour very fast. And the reason I say it went from 60 to 100 is we were already gone from 0 to 60 with COVID. We had already been in this COVID fight for a number of weeks. And the Salt Lake County Emergency Coordination Center was already pretty much fully staffed for COVID. And it was interesting then to make the pivot from COVID and set aside the COVID operations and move into the earthquake operations. The first piece of this that I'll relay from a local level is I was actually on my way into work at the Emergency Coordination Center on Bangerter Highway at about 4100 South when the quake actually struck. My pickup truck actually did a little bit of a fishtail, like you might experience when you get a gust of tailwind that pushes your vehicle around. And I thought, well, that's strange. There doesn't appear to be any wind. About 5 seconds later, my phone lit up. I was getting notifications from the U.S. Geological Survey and the University of Utah and my staff and everything else that we had an earthquake, and it looked like it was centered in Magna, and it was around a 6.0 magnitude was the initial information we got. So very rapidly, because of the COVID disaster, we were able to pivot, like I said, and redivert resources into the Quake response. Initially, we had about 300 people at the Salt Lake County Emergency Coordination Center within an hour of the quake striking and subsiding, working directly on the earthquake with our municipal level partners, our state level partners, and the state was already talking to the feds. Even the federal government was starting to front load its response for a Wasatch Fault earthquake, and they were starting to mobilize their resources as well. So again, things started to happen very, very rapidly. Just so everybody kind of understands the sequence of the events, we had to make sure that our own structure, our emergency coordination center, actually was in a position that we could maintain operations in it, and it was safe to do so. Once we had done that, we started reaching out to, again, to our local partners and doing what we call preliminary damage assessments, asking for that. Fire departments were responding to calls that were life safety type issues. Law enforcement was doing the same. We were using public works assets, parks and rec assets, and even some volunteers to help us with those preliminary damage assessments to help get a picture of where the damage was that we had suffered from this quake. It turns out, and most of you know this already, that most of our damage was suffered in the Magna area, especially Magna, Maine, for those businesses, those old unreinforced masonry structures along Magna, Maine. We suffered some fairly significant damage in West Valley. In particular, there was a mobile home park that was struck very hard, knocked a lot of the structures off of their foundations. And then the other place that we experienced a lot of damage was in Salt Lake City. Again, older structures, unreinforced masonry buildings, developing cracks, pieces of the facade falling off and onto the streets. And as the professor mentioned, fortunately, we didn't suffer any significant injuries or fatalities as a result. However, looking at the statistics, we did the fire department and the emergency medical response folks did go on on an increased number of cardiac related problems within the next 2 hours, strangely enough. So one of the most significant things that we experienced, at least at the county level in conjunction with our city partners, was that because of the earthquake, Kennecott Koper, one of their facilities suffered damage and experienced a very significant hazardous materials leak. Unified Fire Authority, West Valley, West Jordan, a number of other agencies, Salt Lake City, responded with crews out to the Kennecott facility, and again, a great partnership with Kennecott Koper to work on identifying exactly what was leaking, what mitigation measures could be taken to resolve that leak, and what potential protective actions that we perhaps had to take because of the hazardous materials leak. So we weren't only dealing with just the earthquake incident, we had what we call an incident within an incident. We had a hazmat incident going within the earthquake itself. So that complicated our response issues somewhat, put a further drain on our resources. As it turns out, the hazardous materials leak was very significant. The plume was significant. The weather patterns were in our favor early on in the incident, but towards around 11:30, we were looking at maybe those weather patterns to change. And so as a result, within about an hour and a half of getting notifications from the crews out at Kennecott Koper, the staff at the Emergency Coordination Center, which includes, again, my staff from emergency management. We had public works folks there. We had Salt Lake County Health Department folks there. We had Salt Lake County Public Works folks there. We had Unified Police Department and Sheriff's Office people there. We had a number of subject matter experts all collaborating within that space, we were planning the evacuation essentially of the entirety of Magna. And we were able to accomplish completing that plan, including evacuation routes, resources to evacuate folks, places to evacuate folks to, messaging, et cetera, in about an hour and a half with that staff. As it turns out, we never had to initiate that plan because the weather pattern did not shift as originally expected, but we were within a very short time period of having to pull the trigger on that evacuation. So again, that displays the kind of challenges that these type of events can bring above and beyond just the normal, what we consider normal for an earthquake as far as structural failure or those kinds of issues. So it was a very, very busy morning. As the day wore on, the damage assessments continued to roll in. The fire and police response continued to be high, but it wasn't in a position such that the local resources were being overwhelmed. Mayor Wilson, the individual cities had made earthquake declarations. Mayor Wilson made an earthquake declaration to the state. The governor followed very shortly thereafter with a state level declaration requesting information our resources from the federal government. And so that whole process had begun too. And then that information trickled back down from the feds to the state, to the county, to the cities. So we were able to catch those resources and receive them and be able to use them to their maximum potential. Again, as the day wore on, things calmed a little bit as far as emergency response goes. We didn't have any indications of people being trapped, though we had a number of close calls, if you will, when we heard about the various elementary schools and the junior high that had suffered significant damage. There was a great deal of concern about potential injuries and entrapments at those facilities. Those were cleared very rapidly, and we were able to put those to rest. So we did not necessarily need to call on the entire depth of resources that became available to Utah and Salt Lake County and its communities as a result. So that was very fortunate. But there was a tremendous number of resources that were locked and loaded, if you will, and ready to roll into the state should we need them. It was funny, after about a day, we looked at it the day after, and it's like, did we have an earthquake? Because, there were a few bricks on the ground in places. That's not to minimize what people experienced, the folks that did suffer damage, but what was really complimentary to our citizens, and it just reinforces again what we've all known about the citizens here in Salt Lake County and in Utah. There was a great deal of neighbor helping neighbor going on. Folks that maybe hadn't suffered as much damage or no damage helping the folks that had, getting debris removed, trees moved off of roofs. If people were displaced, relatives and friends were stepping up to move those folks into their homes. So they didn't need emergency sheltering. So that culture of neighbor helping neighbor that is so prevalent in Utah was very, very helpful for us. We stepped very early into what we call a recovery mode, trying to get life back to the new normal for everybody. And that includes assistance from state and federal government as far as monetary assistance, trying to get people back into their homes, small business loans that for businesses that are affected. And there are two federal programs. One is called PA, or Public Assistance, that focuses on public infrastructure and public type facilities. The other one is called IA, or Individual Assistance, which focuses on individual homes and homeowners and losses there. For the IA, for the individual assistance, FEMA paid out about $1 million. And while that may seem like a very low amount, please understand that that the programs that are in place have to subtract out whatever insurance coverage is available to the individuals before they can pay additional. And then there is a cap. There's a misconception, if you will, that the federal government just rolls in with its checkbook open and makes everybody whole. And that is not necessarily the case. An example might be if you had a chandelier fall and break during the earthquake, the federal government is not necessarily going to replace your chandelier. They will buy you a light bulb to put in the light fixture, however, if that makes sense. So about $1 million total in assistance for IA. SBA loans, about $2.3 million. We help facilitate, the state and Salt Lake County help facilitate that. And the public assistance piece is ongoing. So right now, with the damage assessments that we have, according to HAZUS, which is a collection point that the federal government uses for damage, there's a potential for about $62 million worth of structural damage and about $629 million in economic loss. Those are estimates. Those aren't hard numbers. But as the professor said, this was a moderate quake. And even with the moderate quake, those are the kinds of damages that the Salt Lake Valley incurred because of this quake. I'll just finish with, again, re-emphasizing some of the preparedness things that you've heard over and over again throughout the years. Basic family essentials, 96-hour kits, family emergency communications plans, understanding where the vulnerabilities are in your homes are and trying to mitigate those. For example, is your water heater strapped to the wall? Do you know where your gas shutoff is? A lot of those very basic essentials become very, very important in these kinds of events. And as was stated earlier, they're not only good for earthquakes, they're good for a myriad of other things. And we experienced that again in September when we got the straight line wind event that came through and knocked around Salt Lake City and Mill Creek pretty heavily. Same types of preparedness type planning and supplies served those citizens well in that instance as well. So with that, I won't take any more of your time. I know there's a lot of other presenters going on. I'm happy to answer any questions that anybody might have for me.
Yeah, great. Clint, thank you very much for that frontline perspective. There are a couple questions. Russ is asking, how well did the incident command system work for this event?
So the incident command system, we had an incident command system in place for COVID, as I had mentioned. And because of the familiarity of all the players with the incident command system and the flexibility of the system, and the fact that it's standardized from local to county to state to federal, it actually worked very well. The pivot was very smooth. There was a little confusion at first, of course, as everybody was understanding what the threat was. But the ICS system actually worked very, very well. Even the tactical commanders in the field dealing with the hazmat incidents or the medical calls or whatever they might be, were able to interface very, very easily into the larger structure. And we were in a position to make sure we understood the problems that were facing them and provide them with any additional support should they need it.
Great. George is asking, did fire suppression suffer any reduction in hydrant availability due to the quake?
I don't have exact numbers on that, sir. I do know that there, for a time, some of the water systems were reduced in pressure, or some of the circuits were taken offline because of suspected damage in the Magna area and in West Jordan as well. And it turns out later on in doing damage assessments, one of the large storage tanks in West Jordan actually suffered some damage. So again, I don't have exact information on that, but interruptions as we understood them and as were reported to us were very small, limited to small areas, and did not last for more than a few hours.
Right. Thank you for those questions. Thank you, Clint. And we'll have Emily come up next, please. Emily, you can bring your camera up and you can go ahead and start your presentation.
Thank you, Wade. Let me just share my screen. Okay, can you see a title slide?
It is, yes, now we can.
Okay. Oh, actually, I forgot to optimize video. Sorry, let me do this one more time. Okay, now do you see my screen?
Yes, yes, we
Okay.
can see it.
Well, thank you, Wade, and thank you to DEM for organizing this town hall, and thank you all for being here on this anniversary of this crazy geological event. You know, I hope as a professional geologist, I hope this is the only earthquake that I ever respond to here on the Wasatch Front. So my name is Emily Clever, and I'm a geologist with the Utah Geological Survey, and I specialize in earthquake geology. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about the geologic setting here on the Wasatch Front and why we call Utah earthquake country. So Keith and those at the University of Utah Seismograph stations, they study the data that the earthquakes create in real time. Myself and my colleagues at the Utah Geological Survey, we study the geology of the earthquakes, or how earthquakes have made their mark on our rocks, on our soils in the geologic past. So I hope in this presentation and within this whole town hall, you really embrace the old adage of knowledge is power, and that by learning some new things about this earthquake and learning alongside with myself and Keith and the many scientists who are learning about this earthquake as well, I encourage you to be curious about our shaky setting, and hopefully you can get some new information today to help you be prepared and not scared. So first, I'm going to cover a few basic terms and concepts. So in our region of the West, we often have earthquakes occurring on faults that dip below the surface. Keith kind of alluded to this in his part of the talk. So this diagram here represents a slice of the earth as a block, and the line that's cutting through the side represents a fault zone, or a zone of weakness in the Earth's crust. And this is where earthquakes generate. So when an earthquake happens, the energy dissipates out in all directions, as shown by the arrows in the diagram, and also by the wave fronts that are pointed out in the diagram. So this earthquake energy is radiating out in all directions, kind of like when you throw a stone into a pond. And this energy is the shaking that we experience during the earthquakes. And one thing that is really important to note is that if an earthquake is large enough, so if it's a magnitude 6.5 or so in this region, it will rupture the surface. So like Keith mentioned, the Magna earthquake was about a 5.7, sorry. So it was not strong enough to rupture the surface. And I'll talk a little bit later about what we actually saw from the earthquake. So in our region of the Basin and Range in the West, when the earthquakes are large enough to occur that rupture the surface, over geologic time, they create a really distinct mark on the surface that the geologists call a fault scarp. So this is what we use to determine when and where earthquakes have occurred in the past. So if you've ever seen a map of Utah or Salt Lake that show lines that are depicting faults, this is what we're identifying. We're identifying these fault scarps. So now, how do we determine when earthquakes have occurred? So to do that, we have to imagine taking a slice out of the fault scarp. So where the red line is, imagine that we're kind of taking a slice of the fault scarp real quick. So here's our model of what that fault scarp looks like in cross section, similar to some of the diagrams that Keith showed. So in our model slice of the ground, you can see that the earthquake has ruptured the surface. So I'm going to be stepping through time to show how these scarps form and how we use them to study earthquakes. So first we have an earthquake that happens, it ruptures the surface, and then next time passes, seasons, years go by, where rain and snow and wind and other erosive forces cut down the fresh earthquake scarp and create a small deposit. And so a deposit is just another word that we use to describe when sediments, soils, and rocks are moved from one place to another by something that happens on the surface of the earth, like rain and wind and snow and things like that. So then we step through time and another earthquake happens instantaneously, and it displaces the previous earthquake deposit. Then we have the same thing happen again. Erosion creates another deposit, and I think you get the picture. But what happens is that over time, these deposits layer, and they layer all these earthquake soils and deposits, and they create these fossilized earthquakes. So as geologists, what we do is we study those earthquake soils. So the way that we do this is we dig. Not all geologists, we don't just look at rocks, we look at dirt too. So what we do is we excavate these large trenches across these fault scarps to study the earthquake soils and determine when earthquakes have happened in the past. And we can also estimate the magnitudes of the earthquakes. And remember, to make a fault scarp, you have to have a large earthquake. You're not seeing the magnitude 3 earthquakes, and I'll show you later, or even the magnitude 5 earthquakes. So from these trenches, and I should say the Wasatch Fault is one of the best studied faults of its type in the whole world with this type of study. So we have a lot of data. And so when we compile all this data together, and we correlate it across the entire fault zone, we get an idea of how many large earthquakes we've had in the past. So this slide is showing a map of the Wasatch Fault on the left, compiled compiled earthquake data on the right. And so you can see in the center, that's where the Salt Lake City segment of the Wasatch Fault is. And studying these past earthquake deposits over the last 10,000 years has shown that there's been at least 22 large magnitude, so magnitude 6 or 7 or magnitude 6.5 or 7 earthquakes. So in the last 10,000 years. So on average, that's a large earthquake every 300 years. And the jarring thing is that the last earthquake on the Wasatch, we can detect from using this methodology, was about 300 years ago on the Nephi segment. And on the Salt Lake City segment, it was about 1,200 years ago. And we can also calculate recurrence intervals from this data. So this is where we get that phrase that the Salt Lake City segment is overdue for an earthquake. So this is how we determine from the geologic record where and about when we've had large earthquakes. So fast forward to the Magna earthquake. And, the seismologists, they study the earthquakes in real time. And, geologists were looking at those old earthquakes. But this is it was a real fun opportunity for us to learn a lot more about seismology and learn from each other, the geologists and seismologists. So I'm going to show a video of some of the seismological data from the seismograph stations, and we'll talk about it a little bit. So we start off looking at the Salt Lake Valley in map view, and then we dive underneath the valley to watch the earthquake sequence. So this will show the earthquake aftershocks happening. So we start off with the magnitude 5.7 main shock on March 18th, followed by shallower aftershocks happening right above it. And then at the end of March 18th and into the 19th, we see a robust sequence of aftershocks above the hypocenter. We can also start to now imagining this west tipping fault that Keith was mentioning. And then finally, we see earthquakes that happen a little bit up, a little bit shallower and underneath the airport. These are also related to the Magna sequence as well. So using this earthquake data, and then also using a lot of geologic data that we compile at the Utah Geological Survey. So this is, if you've ever seen a geologic map, there's a lot of information that goes into making those maps. There's a lot of intuition that the geologists build in creating those maps and understanding not only what the surface looks like, but what the surface underneath, what the faults look like underneath. So this slide is depicting our interpretation of combining the seismic data that is coming from the seismograph stations, as well as our interpretation of the geologic data from our geologic mapping. So what our data says is essentially we agree with what the seismograph stations have interpreted, that the Wasatch Fault could be dipping at a shallower angle than previously thought. We also were able to add a little bit more detail and show a few more faults that are above the within the Wasatch Fault zone that could have been contributing to the Magna event itself. Now, going back to thinking about earthquakes in the geologic record, this was a moderate earthquake, the Magna event. So it was pretty unremarkable in terms of, what the geology did. So the strongest effect that we saw from the earthquake was liquefaction. And so this is a drone photo showing the Saltair concert venue off I-80. And you can see that we're close to the shores of the Great Salt Lake and that there's surface water in these retaining ponds and in the interchange. So this is an example of something that we saw as geologists that indicated that an earthquake happened. So this is an example of liquefaction, which is something that happens when the soils that are saturated with water, especially along shores of lakes and rivers, actually loses its strength and deposits on top of the surface. So this was the main effect that we saw. We didn't see any surface fault rupture, and we wouldn't expect that with the magnitude of the earthquake. So we still took lots of pictures and were able to document this earthquake. But in terms of the geologic record, we're asking ourselves, would we see this earthquake? And the answer is essentially no, because it's, these are small deposits compared to what we would see from a larger magnitude earthquake, like at a 6.5 or 7. So to kind of contextualize that, I want to look at our historic record of earthquakes that have happened in Utah. So this is a map of Utah showing all of the earthquakes, most of the earthquake epicenters, from the last 50 years or so. And the dots are scaled by the magnitude of the earthquake. So this first map is showing everything from, a magnitude 1 up to a 6.5. If we filter out the earthquakes that are smaller than what our Magna earthquake was, you can see that we don't have a lot of earthquakes that have happened over time. Keith had a great graphic that showed that. So this makes me think of our liquefaction features. So how would these be preserved in the geologic record? Not very well, right? Then there has been one surface fault rupturing earthquake that happened in Utah, and that was in 1934, and that was the magnitude 6.6 on the north side of the Great Salt Lake. And all of this is to show you that the geologic record doesn't show all the earthquakes. So it's important for geologists and seismologists to work together when earthquakes happen. And finally, I want to just share a few summary thoughts. So the geologic record shows that we have had large earthquakes in Utah, and that's why we say we live in earthquake country. So we're not crying wolf. We see the evidence, and it is there. So we agree that the Salt Lake City segment of the Wasatch Fault was the causative fault system, and then also it's dipping at a lower angle than previously thought. And like he said, there is still a risk of a large magnitude earthquake on the Wasatch Front. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Emily. A question or two for you here. Dee is asking, does this information mean that a large earthquake will cause the valley floor to tilt? If so, how much tilt are we potentially looking at?
So a large earthquake would definitely cause some movement, but it wouldn't really be detectable by us. There's regional networks, along with a lot of the seismometers. There's also GPS stations that measure constantly are measuring the position of these GPS stations with real time. So we'd probably be able to see tilt in those instruments, but in terms of us as humans, we wouldn't really be able to detect anything.
And I'm not sure if this is relevant, but Tom is asking if you use laser technology or other types of technology to measure mountain peak movement. Is that such a thing as far as related to earthquakes, or?
Not specifically for earthquakes. We do use data that are collected from airplanes using laser scanners that collect high resolution topographic data. So that is something that could be used, and actually is really useful before and after large earthquakes. If you have a very accurate 3D model of what an area looks like before an earthquake and then after an earthquake, you collect the same data set, you can do really interesting differencing between the two to understand really dynamic, how the surface ruptured in the earthquakes.
Okay, thank you very much for those questions. Thank you, Emily, for your presentation. And coming up next is John Crofts, Emergency Management Earthquake Program Manager. Go ahead, John.
Thank you, Wade. I wanted to really give a shout out to everybody that participated in the earthquake. I really enjoyed the presentations by Keith and Clint and Emily, and thank you for letting me follow them, because they were really good. And now I'm feeling a little self-conscious on how I present, because those were excellent presentations. I wanted to say something about the earthquake. I think that everybody, has a pretty vivid memory of what happened and where they were when the earthquake happened. And I was working at the State Emergency Operations Center, and a lot of times, the state, we work with the federal partners, we work with local communities, and so many times when there is a disaster, or of any sort, whether it be flooding or this earthquake or a pandemic, the employees that are working hard and just cooperating to get things done, sometimes when things go well, public employees don't really get the credit that they deserve or earn. And I think that it was important to point out that this is one of those things that there were a lot of things going on at once. We had a pandemic going on, and this was just not something that we had expected in the middle of a pandemic. And I think that it's worthy to say that everybody, from all our different partners really joined together, and during difficult times, and they worked together and really did an excellent job responding to this. And I think it's very worthwhile to point out that, this was a moderate sized earthquake, and people can and do die in these moderate sized earthquakes. And Utah was very fortunate that we did not have one fatality. And I think that we can give some credit to everybody that jumped in, and everybody was going full force with this. Everybody responded well. And I think that, that was expressed, from our governor. Governor Herbert came and spoke at the EOC, the Emergency Operations Center, the evening of the earthquake. And it was a very interesting time for everybody. And I was just impressed with how well everyone worked together. So tonight, I just want to thank everybody for listening in. And I hope that I can bring something that will be of value to people. And, people and animals and plants and cities and nations and the world, we all go through something called growth. And growth has three aspects. Growth has the aspect of growing, which we are all very aware of, building and growing. And it also has another aspect of shedding. We also have another aspect that we don't always look at with growth, and that's leveraging. And when we leverage information and we leverage what we need to, when we have information that we're looking at, we can learn and grow. We can, visit ready.utah.gov and look at tools that we need to do. Do we have a 24-hour kit, a 48-hour kit? Is that enough? Or, is there something else that we can do, like 2 weeks ready? A lot of people are looking at this going, this was a moderate earthquake. I guess in one sense, we're very lucky it wasn't a 7. And, would a 24-hour kit really be enough? The supply chains, would they be interrupted? Probably. So, something to look at and consider, to have 2 weeks, a kit that's 2 weeks. Do we have 2 weeks of water? Do we have 2 weeks of supplies? Do we have 2 weeks supplies to take care of ourselves? And, I'd really like everybody to, take this earthquake as an opportunity to look at ourselves and really examine what we're doing that we can prepare for and get ready for a larger one. And just like Emily said, I hope that I'm not involved with a magnitude 7 earthquake or a larger earthquake on the fault. I hope that that's the only earthquake that we have to deal with. But we've reviewed the numbers and the chance, and there's always a chance. So just back to talking about growth. So when the pioneers arrived in Utah, just 2 weeks after they arrived in Salt Lake Valley on July 24th, 1847, within 2 weeks, they had started building 700 structures. And they were a very industrious, hardworking people, and they came here to Utah to colonize and to build and to grow. And, what the pioneers did for this state was nothing short of noteworthy. They built a city in the middle of nowhere. The Transcontinental Railroad wasn't even in Utah, didn't go through Utah at the time. So what they did is they built with the existing materials and supplies that were available here, and they used adobe brick. So basically they just took mud and they started drying it out in the sun, and within 2 weeks, over 700 structures were in the process of being built. And it's interesting to note that even though those structures, were today about 300 of those structures are still standing, if you can believe it. And those adobe brick structures, they're and then we graduated and improved those buildings, and we went on to fire kiln bricks, and we had some kilns that were making brick and producing brick throughout the state, and a lot of our buildings were going up and looking at that way. So we started growing immediately in Utah, building and created a beautiful city and a beautiful state with what little we had. And if we're looking at the earthquake risk that we suffer today, there's a lot of changes going on. They've been reviewing all these unreinforced masonry buildings, and in those old adobe brick structures that the pioneers started building 2 weeks after they arrived in different stages of construction, those are what they refer to as unreinforced masonry buildings. And other unreinforced masonry buildings exist and continued after that, which are just basically brick on brick with no steel reinforcement. Today, building codes are higher standards, and those URMs, unreinforced masonry buildings, don't exist. But we have an issue that we have to look at today and that we have to examine. So getting ready for our next earthquake, or preparing for the next earthquake, this earthquake was maybe a good call to action that we can all take. And it's time for us to examine, what can we do to become a more resilient state, a more resilient community, and a more resilient country. And it was interesting because before this earthquake even occurred, we had a URM summit here in Utah, and we had FEMA and several political leaders and business leaders that were involved with that. And we all got together and said, we live in earthquake country, and Utah has we have over 20,000 buildings, 20,000 structures that are URMs, and this is a significant risk. That represents about 20% of the structures that are occupied. So, if we had a significant earthquake, these buildings offer, or they give us a more significant risk than the modern buildings do. So, what are we doing to improve those? Well, the state has been addressing this problem, and the communities have been addressing this problem. Other people are addressing this problem, and there are seismic retrofits going on throughout the state, and people are taking this seriously. Audrey Pierce, as you know, she runs and manages the Fix the Bricks program in Salt Lake City, and that's a program where people can go through and examine their unreinforced masonry homes, and they can have financial assistance to help mitigate some of the dangers of their URMs. And there's a lot of people throughout the state that say, well, I don't live in Salt Lake City and I want to participate as well. And so we're even examining some of the potential to expand that program to other cities as well. And so people are really concerned about these URMs. People are really concerned about being safe in an earthquake. And so that's, Utah's gone through the growth stage, and now we're kind of looking at this like, well, what can we do for the shedding stage? So growth has the three elements. So there's growth and there's shedding. So we can look at that. If we look at the Salt Lake Temple on Temple Square in downtown Salt Lake City, that building is a very important building to Utah history and to the major religion here in Utah. And it's an important building that we protect and keep. And right now, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is doing a major seismic improvement on that building, and making that historic building possible to last through another large earthquake. So that's just one of many projects that's going on. the Utah Seismic Safety Commission took a tour a year and a half ago of the new Salt Lake City International Airport that's being constructed. And that airport is doing so many things correctly. They're making the airport better and more seismically safe. And they're improving that airport so much that if we do have a major earthquake, that airport, their goal is not to just survive the earthquake. They want to have that airport operational soon after an earthquake. And so there's a lot of forward-thinking people in the state that are looking at ways to shed and grow. And I couldn't be more pleased with some of these projects that are going on, and they're going on all over. So we had this URM summit a couple years ago and we looked at ways that we could mitigate some of this risk. And so we brought in all these different groups and people, and we got together and we started talking. What can we do to mitigate this URM threat that we have in the state? We have, it's a pretty high percentage, to say 20% of the buildings that are occupied are URMs, and it needs to be addressed. So we're getting together, and FEMA, the state, and several other parties have been working together on a URM strategy that's going to be made available to residents, and we'll have that posted for people to read. It's over 100 pages, but I'll tell you, it's exciting reading and it's good reading because it tells us how to improve our lives here in Utah. And, resiliency is important. And so, these are tough questions to look at. Do we want to just grow and not shed, or do we want to grow and shed and become stronger and leverage who we are, leverage our sustainability? So by doing this, we're hoping that we will protect life, protect property, protect the environment, and protect commerce. All of those are extremely important to the state of Utah and the people that live here. And Utah's a strong state. We're, a strong people. We really help each other. We work together. And I think that this is a great opportunity for all of us to come together. And, I'd like to mention, go ahead, Wade, you had a question.
I'm sorry, I thought you were ready for questions, but go ahead and finish up.
Well, anyway, I just wanted to say that a lot of people, we get daily phone calls from the state asking what we can do, or what people can do to mitigate their earthquake risk. And, I think that, Be Ready and the tools that are on our website are extremely valuable. We're all used to the drop, cover, and hold thing, and that's good for us to think about. And that should just be part of our muscle memory. If we feel an earthquake, drop, cover, and hold. And then also something that's important for us to consider is all the time, be situationally aware of where we're at, what we're doing. Are we driving and there's an earthquake? What do you do if there's an earthquake and you're driving? Think about that. What do we do if we're shopping? What do we do if we're not at our home? What do we do if we're, in unfamiliar settings? What do we do if we're in bed? What do we do if we're in a situation that we don't know what to do? These are good questions to ask ourselves. And that's the part of leveraging growth that we really need to think about. So, growth consists of growing and shedding and leveraging, and education is the leverage that we need to use. And I really hope that this earthquake will provide us all the opportunity to leverage everything we can and, maybe shed some of the things that we don't need. Maybe some of these URMs, we could look at retrofitting them or improving them in some way or rebuilding to a better way. So anyway, with that, Wade, I don't want to go over my time. I just wanted to thank you personally for allowing me to talk a little bit about this and give credit to all the state and local and federal employees that really jumped in and helped during this earthquake. I think it's really a credit to the state of Utah that we didn't lose one life during this earthquake. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you, John. Very insightful. I appreciate that knowledge that you have about the unreinforced masonry situation here in the state. And that's where this first question is from R. Jorgensen. in terms of technical input to policymakers, do we have sufficient programs and timelines for mitigating unreinforced masonry? And maybe that's possibly outlined in the strategy you just introduced.
Yeah, it is outlined in the strategy, and there are some options and some recommendations that are in the strategy to address just that. Also, people are welcome to attend the meetings with the Utah Seismic Safety Commission. You can type in and we've been holding those meetings virtually since the pandemic has started, and we found that a lot of people like attending those meetings as well. So you can just Google Utah Seismic Safety Commission and it will take you right to the website, and the next meetings are posted right on the website, and you can listen to that. The Utah Seismic Safety Commission serves as a commission that offers recommendations and guidance with earthquake-related risk.
Thank you. And Josh is asking, I think, a little bit of a clarification question here on the number, and I think it might be 140,000 URMs, and I'm not sure where that number is, but Josh is asking, I have read in the Deseret News that there are 76,000 URM single-family homes in Salt Lake County. Was the number 22,000 that you mentioned commercial and multifamily homes, or was that in a specific area?
Yeah, just to clarify that, 20,000 unreinforced buildings throughout the state. That's not just Salt Lake County. That would include other areas as well.
Okay. All right.
And when you say 20,000, that's not an exact number. There might be 20,194. I don't know, but yeah, about that.
Okay. All right. And I think that is it. So thank you very much, John. Appreciate that presentation, and appreciate the question there from Josh. So we will now turn the time over to Kevin Broderick from Utah Strong Recovery Project. Go ahead, Kevin.
Thank you, Wade. I appreciate this opportunity to share, and I really appreciate the presentations that we've heard today. What great science, what great first responders. We really need to appreciate our first responders. They put themselves out there to try and keep us safe and try and keep us healthy and get us the resources that we need. And they put their lives on the line, and so grateful for them. We're going to transition from earth science to perhaps some human science here. I'm going to share my screen with you. Okay, so I'm Kevin Broderick with the Utah Strong Recovery Project, and I'm a crisis counselor, and I'm really, again, grateful to be here to talk about the emotional impact of these types of events. Please know that if you are struggling, or if you know someone who is struggling and you'd like some advice, we have a free helpline that's on your screen here. And you can call us between 7 a.m. and 7 p.m. daily. You can text us, or you can send us an email. We'll be happy to talk to you and get you some resources and support. Earthquakes are complicated emotionally. I mean, they have a significant human impact. Earthquakes are unexpected. They're destructive. They certainly can be terrifying emotionally, mentally, and physically. Earthquakes produce aftershocks. Now, that's a real concern, because when you have the aftershocks, it's almost a reminder or a threat to our safety that here we go again, or where could I go to be safe? Our bodies, our minds are wired for safety, and we want to be safe physically, emotionally, socially. And when our safety is threatened, our body goes into maybe protection drive, and those aftershocks will spark some of those protection drives within us. When I was in Haiti in 2010, we had a group of volunteers staying in a home that withstood well the primary shock, the primary earthquake that happened there. While we were there in the middle of the night, we had a pretty good sized aftershock, and our bed shook and so forth. For me, I figured if this house withstood the primary earthquake, then I'd be okay with the aftershocks. And so I was able to go back to sleep. But what I found when we got up in the morning is that many of the Haitians left their houses, left their structures in the middle of the night after that aftershock, took their bedding and slept in the outdoors. These things really take an emotional toll on us. And it can really complicate our emotional, our physical, our mental, our social, and spiritual responses. So let's take a look at this picture and just ask, what do you see here? Is this a familiar picture? Have you seen a scene like this before? Is this young child mentally ill or emotionally ill? Probably not, right? This child is at the age of stranger danger, and all of a sudden he's placed on Santa's lap, and it's terrifying for this child. And so this is a scene that we've seen before, and we recognize that this child's response is a normal response to an abnormal situation. So just please remember that many abnormal responses are actually normal responses to something that's abnormal, such as an earthquake that we can feel here in Utah. So here's what happens typically. This is just a general graph that identifies some of our responses. Up here, we're moving along in life and we're doing well and just progressing at whatever level we're at and whatever stage we're at in life. A big event here hits, like an earthquake. You know, you get anxiety and disbelief and shock and denial, and it's scary, it's threatening. Then typically, as has been talked about tonight, neighbors come and help neighbors, friends come and help friends. There's optimism, there's altruism, there's gratitude, there's friendship, there's service, there's help going on. What happens sometimes after that uplift is when the dust settles, some of the other emotions, the fears, the anxieties, the grief, the pain, the loss, the sadness, all tend to sink in a little bit deeper. And we can, but not always, take a dip in our moods, in our emotions, in our ability to function. And it will take us some time to recover from such an event emotionally, mentally, and physically for many of us. And as we're recovering, there's ups and downs in that process. And there's triggers, like today being the anniversary, sometimes holidays or other critical events, things that remind us about the scary event that felt threatening and was scary for us. But what most people do is they do recover well. They survive all of these challenges and losses. They accept their responses and they learn to cope with their responses. And then they eventually heal and get back up to a more functional state. Some of the typical responses include, there's several, I just put a few down here, but it's important to think that we are affected emotionally, physically, cognitively, socially, and spiritually. Shock, fear, helplessness, aches and pains, fatigue, sleep disturbance, flashbacks, confusion, sometimes nightmares, withdrawal, clinginess, or relationship tensions. And also spiritually, sometimes feeling abandoned or worthless, or a decrease in our faith and beliefs or practices. So not everybody responds the same way. So we've got to have more than one chart here. Sometimes we have people who experience what we would call a delayed response. A delayed response is after the events and so forth, someone seems to be moving along in life pretty well, but maybe weeks, months, or years after they take that dip and they really have to work through their losses. We see this a lot in families where you have some family members who perhaps are in distress and pain initially. And so other family members within that same household are saying, boy, if I lose it now, the whole family's going to fall apart. And so they keep it going. And then as the family members who initially experience the distress start to progress and feel better and do better, occasionally the other family members will take their turn going through that process. Some people fear that delayed response. You know, that's okay. That's not a problem. It's not necessarily going to be worse waiting to for that response to happen. And so whatever your response is, whether it's immediate or later, it's okay, and it can be worked through. So there's so many different disaster reactions that we could talk about. And when they all hit, and sometimes they all hit at once, we can definitely feel overwhelmed. So we made a chart for that one too. And as you can see, there's all kinds of responses, all kinds of ways, and all kinds of things that occur after disaster. And so being patient again with ourselves and with our loved ones in whatever their response pattern and growth pattern and pain pattern is for them. Now, not everybody responds with pain or distress. We also have resilience. Sometimes it's a mix of the pain responses with resilience, and sometimes it's just more resilience than pain responses. And resilience includes connecting with others. That connection and ability to feel attached to people that we care about is vital for our resilience. Also, maintaining general wellness and practicing healthy thinking and finding meaning in the adversities that we experience are characteristics of resilient people. The good news is that resilience is learnable. Okay, some people have a little bit more than others, and we don't know all the reasons why, but resilience can be learned. We can improve our resilience. We can become more resilient. And so if we go back to our chart, this is what may look like a resilient response, where somebody goes through the event and goes through the challenges, but is able to maintain a good, healthy way of living and progressing without taking that dip into despair or sadness. So I think it's important for us to understand a good definition of resilience. There's lots of definitions about resilience out there. I like this one because I love the three parts to this definition, that resilience is the ability to withstand. We stand strong, we can withstand the storms, and sometimes resilience helps us to withstand what's going on. Resilience is the ability to adapt. Sometimes we couldn't withstand COVID. We're getting better at that now, and we're getting the right medicines and vaccines to withstand COVID. But really, we had to adapt to a COVID life and a COVID lifestyle. So resilience is a part of adapting as well. And resilience is the ability to recover from adversity and stress. We can't always withstand, and we can't always adapt. Sometimes we just take a hit, and resilience helps us to recover, and sometimes recover quickly. Now, I want you to know that there are limitations to resilience. We can be really, really resilient people, but sometimes something hits us at an angle that really hurts. Sometimes the winds are just too strong that we can't withstand those winds, and we have to go through a process of maybe distress and recovery. Let me share with you one person's experience who talked to me about the Magna earthquake. This person is a very capable adult, a professional, a resilient person, but this earthquake kind of hit this person at an angle that made things hard. This person felt unsafe living in Utah. This person was scared at night, and she feared going to sleep. She said that I panicked when I felt aftershocks. I was not sure the earth would stop shaking. I was afraid of the big one, and we've heard about that one or those tonight talked about in Utah. Other responses that she had, the construction to make buildings earthquake safe has scared me. How can I know that I will be in a safe place when the next one hits? I fear for the safety of my family. I never wanted to be alone after the earthquake. She did not want to be on her own. She always wanted to have somebody by her side. And I had earthquake-related nightmares. Now, the good news is that this person did progress, and these are some of the things that she said have helped. She recognized that she was experiencing normal earthquake responses and that she was not going crazy. She understood that her brain's alarm system, that safety and protection system, was still trying to protect her and help her. She started to focus more on self-care and how she could take care of her health and cope with stress and challenges. And she was also using a prescribed medication to help her get sleep at night, which made a big difference for a short-term assistance that way. Also, she would rely on her spiritual beliefs. She would talk to her spouse. She would spend moments of time by herself. So just practicing being by herself until she could feel more comfortable, not having to be with someone all the time. A good friend showed her the safest places in her home, which was really comforting to her. So she knew where to go and knew where it was the most safe. And she learned to treat herself with more kindness and compassion. So those are some things that really helped her. Now, how do we prepare emotionally for disasters, for earthquakes, for emergencies, for really hard things that we face in life? Well, one thing you can do is practice healthy calming skills. We can practice those every day of our life. I've had to practice some of those skills before this presentation, to be honest. How do we calm the nerves that we have? How do we quiet the thoughts that are racing in our minds? How do we relax our bodies when we're feeling tense? So learning healthy calming skills will help you prepare emotionally for challenges that lie ahead. Also building relationships, as we noted before, that the best thing that strengthens a person during a challenge or a hard time is having somebody that they're connected to and that they can relate to. Also, making safety and communication plans. That was talked about tonight. When I've been on disaster response deployments, the most distress that people experience is when they feel like they're not safe, or they feel like family members aren't safe and they don't have a way to communicate, to know where they are, to know how they're doing. That creates a lot of emotional distress, which can be mitigated by having a communication plan and an emergency safety plan with your family. Also, it's important to identify trusted sources of information. Sometimes the media or social media or other people stir up fear and emotions. And sometimes their reports or the information we're looking at isn't reliable or accurate. So you can pre-plan to know, okay, where am I going to go? Who am I going to talk to for accurate and reliable information? You can identify your strengths before a disaster or crisis happens. And that way you can help, whether it's helping to clean up, whether it's helping a child and playing with children, whether it's helping a youth, whatever skills and talents you have, they can be used to benefit your neighbor. they can be used to benefit your community. And so if you're pre-planning, think about some of those strengths and talents that you have. And remember, hope isn't something that just comes. Hope is something that's nurtured. Hope is something that's developed. And practice finding hope in life. Practice finding hope in things that we have around us, and practice gratitude. Because when those disasters hit, it's hard to have hope. Sometimes it feels like our whole world is falling apart, or that we've lost everything. And I've met with people who are there, but some people are able to hold on to hope. And you can practice and develop hope prior to an emergency. So here's a resource you could go to right now, today or tomorrow, that provides really good information about emotional distress, about feeling afraid, about stress, about worry, about loneliness, about grief. You can go to howrightnow.org, and it has reliable and quality information if you'd like to do some self-help work and start that today or tomorrow. Just like to end with the quote from Winnie the Pooh, "You're braver than you believe, stronger than you seem, and smarter than you think." So please feel free to contact us at Utah Strong Recovery Project if you have any questions, if we can be further assistance, if we can connect you with a community resource, or if we can help you help a neighbor who's struggling, please contact us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kevin. Great job there. We have one question. I just want to acknowledge this question. I think maybe you have answered it, but you might could clarify. Dave asks, earthquakes are unplanned and sudden events, perhaps like an unexpected death of a family member.
Yeah.
Is it possible to prepare for these sudden events? And I think you did very well explain that with earthquakes, and I think maybe in general, he might be asking that.
Yeah, thank you. Any disaster, any loss is possible, but most aren't probable. And sometimes we focus a lot on probabilities, which increases fear. And so I think it's important for us to remember, yeah, we're going to experience challenge. We're going to experience loss. We're going to experience things that are unexpected. And definitely when we're not in that situation, we can strengthen our resilience, strengthen our emotional connectedness to prepare for those kinds of events that do inevitably happen at some point.
All right, thank you very much for that question. Thank you, Kevin, for the great presentation there. We're going to ask all of our panelists now to come back up on the camera, if you will, please. We'll close this out. I think there maybe is a couple of other quick questions that we could direct to the panel before we close. First of all, we do want to just clarify one point made in an earlier presentation as far as our unreinforced masonry buildings. I think our inventory shows that we have 147,000 unreinforced masonry buildings in the state. And that's according to, John, where's that according to?
Yeah. So, I don't know, these public town hall meetings, I guess everybody's had their turn saying something incorrect or wrong. And I don't know if I got nervous or whatever. It's 147,000. And in the chat, I put the URM document that references that. So sorry, everyone. And thank you for pointing that out.
Oh, no problem, John. Thank you. So the document that John has shared is in the YouTube chat window. Okay, thank you. All right, there was a question earlier. Let's see if I can find that again here. And it kind of, I think, is overall with the new information that we've received on the Quake science. How does this change our outlook for the future, our planning, our response plans and efforts? Does anybody, what does this mean for the future as far as this new information, the experiences that we had on the day of the Magna quake? Maybe Clint, have you thought about this as far as updating your plans for the future?
Actually, based on information that we were already in the process of updating Salt Lake County's plan, it was time for us to do that on just a periodic review anyway. Based on the lessons learned from last year, we actually are adding some additional aspects to what we call a FIRA, or a threat and hazard analysis, essentially is what a FIRA is, in order to address some of the specific things that we came across during the quake. For example, we had never really considered trailer parks, for example, in our threat analysis when it comes to areas that may see more damage. After the Magna quake, that changed our minds quite a little bit, obviously. So yes, there are things that we have taken to heart as a result of this quake, and again, closer cooperation with our private partners as well. Questar, or Dominion, excuse me, Rocky Mountain Power, our water purveyors, et cetera, to again understand the potential points of weakness in, or better understand the potential points of weakness in our infrastructure. So,
all right, thank you. This question, I'm not sure if we may have the answer for or not, from Dee. And if we don't have the answer, I'll ask Dee to send us an email to bereadyutah@utah.gov, and we'll make sure we can get the answer to this question for you. But it is a good question, one that so hopefully we can find the answer to, and that is Rocky Mountain Power's plan to cut electrical power to a region affected by a major earthquake for damage assessment, given potential for a high number of downed lines. In other words, if we see a lot of damage and downed electrical lines, is Rocky Mountain Power's plan, and we don't have anyone here from Rocky Mountain Power, but like I say, if we don't know the answer, we'll get back to Dee. But is their plan to cut electrical power to a region until they can restore those power lines? I don't know if anyone has that answer. Looks like not. So Dee, if you'll send us an email to bereadyutah@utah.gov, we'll get the answer for you there. Okay, Dan is asking, maybe for Emily or Keith, how would the 5.7 magnitude quake have rated on the earthquake scale used by Japan and the associated felt dynamics? Emily or Keith, do you have that?
I don't know if Keith is on still, but I think what they're asking is, how is the energy released from the Magna earthquake different than the, I'm imagining the 9.0 Tohoku earthquake. And Keith, I see you're on, so I'm going to point to you.
No, I think you're right. The scales are actually calibrated in a sense, so they're not that different. So the Japan scale, they use what are called moment magnitudes, and we actually use moment magnitudes too. And I know it's confusing that there's so many different kind of magnitude scales, but if this earthquake would have happened in Japan, their magnitude for the Magna earthquake, it would have been 5.6, 5.7, 5.8. It would have been quite close to the same value that we have.
Okay, thank you. I want to thank our panelists for joining us tonight and presenting all this very insightful information, a lot of new information that we've learned from the Magna quake, great reminders that we still live in earthquake country and that we need to be prepared for those things, and good tips on what to do mentally. And I know that in the Magna quake, one of the Division of Emergency Management's most engaged Twitter posts was involving anxiety and fear and mental health and what people can do to overcome those issues. And so that's definitely something that can occur in these types of situations and something that people are looking for help on. So I also want to thank all of our behind the scenes assistants on our chat window, our questions and answers that I think we're able to provide a lot of answers for us that we were not able to get to in the time that we have here. So I want to thank all of those people and our technical director, Brian, in the background and running all of the technology as well. And with that, actually, I do want to just mention a couple of quick little announcements. We are having a Be Ready Utah webinar April 9th and 10th, right here at the same location, the Be Ready Utah YouTube channel. It'll be April 9th and 10th from 1 to 5 each day. And if you'll go to Eventbrite and look up that Be Ready Utah webinar, you'll be able to register there. Tickets are free. We invite you to join us there. We also want to invite you to join us in the Great Utah Shakeout, April 15th. And if you go to shakeout.org/Utah, you can register for that. Also free, lots of great resources there. Tips to help you create a great drop, cover, and hold on drill, and get other people to join us as well in the Great Utah Shakeout. And then there was one other point I wanted to bring up as far as our discussion. I saw in the chat window and forgot to mention, though. There were some questions about earthquake insurance, and we just encourage you to shop around. If you go to your insurance agent and get a really high figure or no answer on insurance for earthquake, just shop around a little bit, and you may be able to find something that's affordable and meets your needs. So with that, again, thank you all for joining us. We wish you the best in your preparedness efforts in all the future. Check us out at bereadyutah.gov. There's a lot of great information that we saw tonight also on earthquakes.utah.gov, two great websites to help us out in our earthquake preparedness and knowledge. And with that, we hope to see you next time. Everybody have a great evening. Good night.